Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. Thank you again for joining me. I am in Romans chapter 7, and we're going to be looking at verse 12, but I want to go back to verse 11, where he's talking about the problem that the sin nature took opportunity through the commandment, gave Paul a false impression. That's the kind of the background idea of that word deceived, gave him a false impression, and through it killed me. And then we come to verse 12, which we just kind of hit briefly yesterday, but I want to sit on this verse today because this is a verse I think a lot of people don't understand. And I find a lot of people resort to this verse to try to say, oh, how in the world can you say that we're not under law? And how can you say that the law is not adequate as a guide for Christian living? Because it says, so the law is holy and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. There, we got you. Look, it's holy, righteous, and good. But part of doing what we call exegetical studying or good Bible study is then not just looking at that verse and going, oh, well, it's holy, righteous, and good, so that means it's absolutely the best thing, but to look at what each part of that is saying. And so I'm going to go back and I want to look at some different scriptures that are going to talk to us a little bit about these ideas. And first thing he says about the law and the commandment is that it's holy. And that word holy, both in the Hebrew as well as the Greek, the idea comes across that which is set apart. Okay? That which is set apart to something, set apart to somebody. By doing that, you also set it apart from other things. So Leviticus chapter 11 is a good place to see this. For I am the Lord your God, and you are to sanctify yourself and be holy because I am holy. Now, most translations that I've looked at in advance here, they translate this consecrate. And the problem with that is if you ask most Christians, what does it mean to be consecrated? They have no clue. It is not, in my opinion, a helpful representation of the term. We actually need a few words, in my opinion, to express what is used by this word. Even the word sanctify, I find lots of Christians do not realize that when you're talking about sanctify, you're simply looking at a verb version of the word holy. So sanctify means to set apart. Holy describes one that is set apart. I am holy. God is set apart, and you yourselves are to be holy. We're to be set apart to God. Got that? Well, Israel was. This is specifically talking about Israel. Peter does quote this passage in 1 Peter 1 and shows that this is true of us, should be true of us. And Paul certainly calls us those who are set apart to God or sanctified. We don't really have a word in Greek or in English, that says holify or make holy. So we really need to use a couple of words to make holy, or even to be clear, to make set apart, or simply to set apart. And so he says, you are to sanctify yourselves and be holy because I am holy. Now let's just read on and see what he means by this, because we could come up with all kinds of ideas what we think it might mean to be holy or set apart. But he says, you must not defile yourselves by any of the swarming things that creep on the ground. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. And you are to be holy because I am holy. And this is the law of the land animals, the birds, all the living creatures that move in the water, and all the creatures that swarm on the land, to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between the living creatures that may be eaten and the living creatures that must not be eaten. In other words, he was making Israel holy or set apart to him by telling them that there were things that they could eat and things that they could not eat. That was one way that they demonstrated that they were set apart to God, that they allowed God to designate what they could eat and what they couldn't eat. And that was one way of being holy, kind of as a challenge sometimes to what we might normally think of as holiness. But I think it's important to see that. In fact, he's talking about that, distinguishing between these things. So let's go back. This is Deuteronomy chapter, let's see, where are we here? We are in, I lost my place, pardon me. We are in Leviticus chapter 20, I believe, and it says, "Therefore you must distinguish between the clean animal and the unclean, and between the unclean bird and the clean, and you must not make yourselves detestable by means of any animal or bird or anything that creeps on the ground. Such creatures like that I have distinguished for you as unclean. You must be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I've set you apart." Now, this is a different word than the normal word for holy. This is the word to distinguish. This is the word badal, which means to make a division or divide apart from the other peoples, to be mine. And again, like the passage we just looked at in Leviticus 11, he says the same thing here. One of the things God did to show that, to have Israel visibly before other nations demonstrate that they were really set apart to God, was to not eat certain animals. And God designated those animals as unclean. This is a good place by way to contrast that the law is not for us, because when you come to the New Testament, God declares through 1 Peter, "Don't call anything unclean that I have cleansed, or that I make designating as clean." And that's has a lot to do with Peter's relationship to Gentiles. But Paul tells us the same thing when he's writing to Timothy, and he says, you're not to refuse anything. If you give thanks for it, you can eat it. Okay? So we don't have this regulation anymore, despite the fact that there are still some people in Christianity that try to apply this idea of avoiding eating certain things, and in so doing designate themselves as clean or unclean. So let's go back to our starting passage. It says, for the verse 12, "So the law is holy and the commandment is holy." And that is, it was a holy commandment. It didn't encourage unholiness. It actually promoted, designed ways to make people set apart. But there were a lot of other things. Those were the easiest examples. Don't eat these things that these other people eat. But there's a lot of other examples of that kind of holiness that distinguished them from the nations that we have over there in the books of the law. Second of all, he says the commandment is also not only holy, but it is also righteous. And if we look over here in Deuteronomy 6:25. Now, some of your Bibles saying this will be righteousness to us, but very simply, and I'm using the HCSB here, it says righteousness will be ours if we are careful to follow every one of these commands before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. Now, keep in mind, this isn't righteousness before God, because the book of Romans and the book of Galatians tell us that by works and by law, no one is righteous before God. But this was righteous in order to approach the temple or the tabernacle, allowed them a physical earthly activity of righteous. And this actually, to make sure you understand this, even an unbelieving Jew could be righteous on this level in order to come to the tabernacle or come to the temple. And if they kept the activities of the law, then they actually had a righteousness that other people could observe. But it wasn't an eternal righteousness before God. It's just a righteousness that could be humanly produced. So the law never encouraged people to be unrighteous. The law actually promoted or encouraged people in a practical righteousness. And I think that that's very important for us to understand as we're looking at this. In fact, if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4, one of the things that Moses says, that if they would keep the law, if they would do these things, then the nations around them would say, what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I've set before you today? Statutes being those things that are cut in stone, was the idea of that. And this word for that's translated, I can't get it to come up in this version here, but it has to do with these commands in this. So righteous is all this law that I have set before you today. And he says that would be righteous. That would be right. And people could observe that outward righteous activity that they were doing. Let's go back over here to chapter Romans 7 and verse 12, he says, so the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous. So it encouraged them, it promoted practical righteousness, but it also promoted practical goodness. And so if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 24, and this is in this context where we're just looking at this just a moment ago about, let's actually go back to that passage and pick up the context. He is talking in there that if they would do these things in this activity, the Lord commanded us to follow all these statutes and to fear the Lord our God for our prosperity. And that word prosperity is our word for good. Okay. Always for the preservation as it is today. In other words, that you might live as you are today. And then he says righteousness would be ours, which we just saw. But this word that it might be good. Now, if you went over to Deuteronomy 28, which we've referred to in the past, Deuteronomy 28, you have a list of the blessings and the curses. And the blessings were the carrot on the stick that were to encourage Israel to obey the law. They got good things. If they obeyed the law, they got or experienced good things from God. Their kids were healthy. Their livestock were healthy. Their fields produced well. Their bread bowl, as a result, was full, and everybody could be happy because they were materially prosperous. That was a benefit of keeping the law for Israel. The blessing, on the other hand, was the curse, on the other hand, was a removal of all of those things. And people got sick, and their children were carried away as slaves, and their livestock were sickly and died, and their crops did not perform well, and the people went hungry, and plagues would go through the land. In other words, that was the stick that poked them from behind to obey the law, was all the negative things that they could experience. So the goodness then was to encourage them to pursue those things that really would make for real happiness, and that was things that were in the law because God could provide that for them. That's what he meant. If we go back over here and see if we put this in the context and we just look at what he's saying, Paul's saying the law wasn't bad. The law promoted the people being set apart to God. The law promoted people to act righteously. And the law even demonstrated God's goodness and encouraged goodness on part of the people. Nothing in that of itself was bad. But none of that, all of that is a motivation, but none of that actually was a motivation that ever worked well with Israel. The history of Israel demonstrates that. But it could not help them to overcome their sin nature other than simply telling them, hey, if you obey the sin nature, here's a good thing you can get in place. And if you disobey and you do what the sin nature wants, you're going to get poked. That would be the best that a New Testament believer could come by. And in reality, that doesn't even work for us because guess what? God's not abiding by those blessings and curses that he instituted for Israel under the law, because we're not under that law system anymore. So in that way, the law doesn't even motivate us in that same way. You could be a diligent law keeper today, and you aren't guaranteed any of those promises, any of those blessings that God made to Israel under the law, because that's not the way God is trying to motivate believers today. So hopefully that's helpful in understanding what Paul says here in Romans 7 verse 12. And I believe that that's important because if you have an improper view of the law and you think that the law is something that God still wants you and I to keep today and still impose on us, you're never going to be able to have a good day in the Lord because you're not relating to the Lord as he wants you to relate to him today in the present time. And I would like you, God wants you, to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you so much for joining me today.